This is going to be the most depressing episode of Young Heretics yet, or probably ever. Hello, welcome to Young Heretics. We are here today starting a study of T.S. Eliot. And in particular, we are starting with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a poem you may have heard of because it is ridiculously famous. It's in fact probably the most famous poem of its period, which is the modernist period, something we are going to talk a lot about. In fact, let's take a moment just right now to talk about why we would be doing the modernist period right now on Young Heretics when we've been focusing actually a lot on sort of ancient wisdom. I did a whole series, or rather a whole episode, on the abolition of man, in which I basically argued that Lewis is the greatest intellectual of the 20th century precisely because he gives you the tools to reject modernity, or rather to reject perhaps modernism. And now here we are working on T.S. Eliot, thinking about T.S. Eliot, who is perhaps the great modernist, at least in poetry, in lyric poetry. Why? Why do we care about this modern poet, exceedingly depressing, exceedingly sad, and in many ways sort of a departure from all of the kind of high, noble classicism that we've been talking about a lot on this show? Why are we paying attention to him? Well, I think that Eliot is indisputably one of the greats, as of course many people do. And I think that it's important for us to care about him as one of the greats, first of all, because we can't just ignore or shrug aside all of the stuff that is currently going on in the West. And I think a lot of the sort of difficulty and the despair and the suffering that we are currently struggling with in the West can be found, dealt with, and faced up to in The Wasteland. So that's the first reason, is that we can't just ignore, we can't just pretend like it's classical Athens. You know, we can obviously go back to the 400s BC and care very deeply about all of the wisdom that comes from those ancient period, but we can't just, imagine that we live there. We do actually live in the modern world. And so we are going to spend time on Young Heretics dealing with the works, the great works of the West, of the modern world. Another important reason that we need, I think, to focus on Eliot, or why it's going to be important to focus on Eliot, is because he was sort of like C.S. Lewis. He was another one of these major public figures who converted very publicly to Christianity. He began as a Unitarian. He was born into this Unitarian tradition, which we will talk about, but he converted very publicly to Anglo-Catholicism, to Anglican Christianity. And unlike Lewis, who really kind of became famous after his conversion, Eliot was famous before, during, and after his conversion. So there are great works by T.S. Eliot, both in his sort of pre-Christian period and phase, and then in his post-Christian, or his Christian, rather, phase. It's a period after his conversion. And so we're actually going to we're going to do a series of episodes on Eliot that track his conversion. We can actually track his conversion by reading the works that he was writing during it. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a 2-episode series on The Wasteland. So this is the first of 2 episodes on this tremendous poem, The Wasteland, which Eliot wrote before he converted to Christianity. So that's why this is the depressing part, right? This is the depressing part because it's the part where Eliot sort of faces up to the emptiness of the world without the Christian God, and to the emptiness of the world between the world wars, which we've talked about already a little bit before on this podcast. We're going to go back to that kind of sad, drab period and engage with some of the reaction that Eliot had to that despair. And again, the point here is that we are facing up to the despair, right? There's no point in happy talk, even if eventually what we believe in is God and truth and joy and nobility, even if, the point of this podcast in many ways is to rediscover those things and the richness of those things in the Western tradition. There's no point in just making those things up where they don't exist and in pretending like things are going great when they're not. And one of the things that's magnificent about The Wasteland, as I'm going to argue, is that it does not give you any easy answers, and it doesn't just hand you sort of hope or joy on a platter. It makes you work for it in the reality of what's currently going on. So we are going to do 2 episodes on The Wasteland. They will each stand alone, but I think you should also watch them together once they're all out, or listen to them together once they're both out, because they're going to form a sort of coherent argument about how this poem works and where you can find hope, even in the kind of darkness and despair of Eliot's vision of the modern world. And then later on, not immediately, but later on, we will do a 2-part series on 4 quartets, which is Eliot's great work as a Christian. The one that when he really comes into his own as a Christian, 4 quartets is kind of his other great contribution to poetic literature. So we'll start with The Wasteland, and it is going to be bleak. It is going to be a depressing, gritty, sad episode of Young Heretics, but I'm also going to lead you through the depressing bleakness of The Wasteland and argue that it's important to sit with that, to sit with the depressing bleakness, because it is part of modernity. There's no question. It's part of what the West is going through, even still, right now. But I am also going to argue that the seeds of hope exist both in this poem and in the current state of the West. But before we get into any of that, let us just briefly talk about who is this dude? Who is T.S. Eliot? I mentioned him as one of a kind of bunch of actually British poets who converted publicly to Christianity, British literary figures who converted publicly to Christianity. I mentioned also Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, other sort of literary figures. But in fact, Eliot is not originally a Brit. He was not born in Britain. He's what we commonly call an expatriate, meaning that he was originally an American, but then sort of left his home country behind and fully adopted England as his own country. So he's born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri. And he's one of what's called the Boston Brahmins. This is sort of an old-fashioned term for America's old upper class. And his family is a Boston Brahmin family. So he's born into this kind of very elegant and elite, but American royalty in St. Louis, Missouri. And he's kind of a sickly kid. He's not the strapping war hero that C.S. Lewis was. When we talked about Lewis, I mentioned that he had gone off and fought in the First World War, and that was an important part of his own kind of journey as an intellectual and as a critic. T.S. Eliot is much more kind of what you think of when you think of the pale, sad academic, right? He was born with a double inguinal hernia, a congenital double inguinal hernia. And not to go too deeply into sort of the medical specifics of what that is, but guys in particular who are listening to me will know that that is not a fun thing to have to be dealing with. It's an internal, intestinal, and sort of related to your genitals. It's incredibly painful and difficult condition. So some people think that, Eliot, part of how Eliot becomes enamored of literature and what makes him so, obsessed with books, I guess, is that he is this sad kid that is kind of sickly and outside of the mainstream of life as a young boy. And there's probably some truth to that. I'm sure that there's some biographical truth to that. But as we will get into, Eliot's bookishness is much more than just his biography, right? The stuff that he contributes to literature is not just, something that you can chalk up to, he was kind of sitting indoors all day, all the time. But yeah, so he's a sickly kid. And he eventually goes to Harvard. And then he goes on to sort of do graduate work all over. He spent some time at the Sorbonne, which is the great university in Paris. He spent some time in Oxford, my beloved home, my academic home, as it were, at Merton College. And then finally he goes back to Harvard and he gets a PhD in philosophy. But after that, after he finishes all of this sort of academic work, this graduate work, he ends up settling back in London because that's where he sort of begins to find, in some ways, his spiritual home. The place that he feels most at peace and comfortable is London, or the place where he feels most inspired and able to work and find sort of like-minded friends and people. So he becomes an expatriate. He will eventually become a British subject and renounce his American citizenship and becomes fully sort of British, which is why we can count him among this British movement of converts, even though he is not, in fact, born in the UK. During his graduate work, he gets particularly into Sanskrit and into Buddhism and Hinduism and these kind of ancient Eastern religions or philosophies or whatever you want to call them. So Sanskrit is obviously one of the ancient languages that is not typically part of the, classical canon, not part of the Hebrew, Latin, and Greek that you would study if you were classics. And so he has this kind of interest that sort of sets him apart from a lot of the guys that we have studied so far, who were much more focused on what we are interested in on this podcast, which is the West. Eliot is also interested in the East, and that is going to come up in the Wasteland. That's a big part of kind of how he forms his vision of modern Europe and of London, especially in this poem. It's kind of filtered through this Buddhist and or Hindu lens. So we're going to get to that. Section 3 of the Wasteland in particular is called the Fire Sermon, which is one of the Buddha's great, probably his greatest sermon, recorded sermon. It's a little bit like the Sermon on the Mount, but in Buddhism. So we'll get to that. But the other thing to note about Eliot's life, one, he spends time as a banker. In fact, he spends a lot of time as a banker. He works at Lloyd's Bank, and he actually kind of, he says at one point that he sort of enjoys working as a banker, and it's something that he does. It's to support himself while he's working on his poetry. It's not obviously a tremendously lucrative deal to go out writing lyric poetry, even if you end up being super famous. And this, Eliot is not fabulously independently wealthy, and so he supports himself working at Lloyd's as a banker. He starts there at 1917, and that's the same year that he publishes this collection of poem called Prufrock and Other Observations. And that collects into one volume a bunch of poems that he'd published before, including the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is maybe his other kind of great poem. Besides Wasteland and the 4 quartets, which we will study, he also has published this one other poem, which we will do in some other episode, but we're not actually going to spend too much time on it. So sort of round about the time that he's launching his poetic career, he's also supporting himself as a banker, which I just find hilarious, but also, fascinating that he's kind of out there in the business world, sort of enjoying himself, but nobody knows at this point yet that he's going in many ways to sort of transform, or at least contribute greatly to modernist literature. So 1915, he publishes the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. 1917, he starts at the bank and publishes that compilation, including Prufrock. And the other thing that happens in 1915 is he marries Vivian, his first wife. He remarried. He later had another wife, but Vivian was his first wife. And so Vivian Eliot becomes, his wife in 1915. And it is not a happy marriage, man. It's famous. It's one of the sort of famous unhappy marriages in literary history and the story of Western literature. He says at one point, and we're going to get into it, he says, "To her, the marriage brought no happiness. To me, it brought the state of mind out of which came the Wasteland," which will tell you a lot, right? Because I've already said this is going to be the most depressing episode of Young Heretics. The Wasteland itself is not a tremendously happy poem. And so if he's the reason he's in the state of mind that produces the Wasteland is because of his marriage to Vivian, that will tell you a little bit. Now, there's more to that story, as there is to every marriage that lasts any length of time, right? Their relationship was intimate, at least, if it was not happy all the time. And they did, she did read drafts of The Wasteland. There's records of her sort of commenting on his work. She, was a bit of a nervous wreck and had health issues herself. So, she had her own problems and neuroses and difficulties to deal with. And I think he was not really, it may be said, in the headspace. He was not really in the place to deal with this, with supporting this poor, struggling wife, because he himself was not tremendously healthy. We talked about the fact that as a kid, he was kind of a sickly child. But in 1921, his health started really breaking down again. So he's working at the bank at this point, but he takes a leave of absence at the recommendation of a doctor. And he starts, sort of going to these like seaside escapes. First he goes to Margate, which is in Britain, and then he ends up traveling further afield to Lausanne. And in both of those places, he is trying just basically to kind of get away from it all and recover from his rapidly deteriorating health and mental state. And this is, I think, something to note in the history of this poem and to pay attention to, that he is, that Eliot is trying to recuperate from a series of mental and physical disorders, that he's in recovery while he's writing this poem. Eventually, later on this podcast, we're probably going to talk about Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which to me it's a novel. And to me, it expresses something kind of central to this period leading up to and between the world wars, the major wars in Europe, which is that one of the big reactions to this total cataclysmic event of just Europe kind of eating itself alive, destroying itself in these world wars, one of the major reactions, especially on the part of young men, was nervous breakdown and sickliness, just the impulse to kind of remove yourself from everything and just try and find some place to recover away from it all. The hero of The Magic Mountain, Mann's novel, basically spends the entire novel in a health facility, in a recovery facility. And retreats of this kind were not uncommon, especially among literary types. So that's kind of the atmosphere that we can imagine Eliot in while he's writing The Wasteland. He writes The Wasteland as he drafts the first draft of The Wasteland as he is sort of retiring from society in order to get away from it all. And it's in between the wars, right? It's the 1920s. In between the two world wars. And as we get into this poem, I think you'll note that there is this cloying atmosphere of sickliness in the world, just being kind of sick of everything that's going on and wanting to remove yourself from this Europe, which is eating itself alive. And you've become so, in many ways, it was a terrible disillusionment to watch World War I consume the youth of Europe and Britain. And you can totally imagine how it would prompt nervous breakdown, how it would lead you to want to retire and remove yourself. So that's what happens to Eliot. He's kind of away from the world as he's writing this poem. And then in 1922, he goes to Paris and gives the manuscript of the poem to Ezra Pound. Now, Ezra Pound is another expatriate. He's another sort of famous literary figure who removed himself from America into Europe. And you can't talk about T.S. Eliot without talking about Ezra Pound, because it is one of the great editorial relationships in all of Western literature and in all of European literature. The two of them have this tremendously close working relationship. And I think a lot of times when we read a great work like The Wasteland, this kind of monumental achievement, we think of it as being the product of this one great mind. And of course, in many ways, that's true. In many ways, you can't have The Wasteland without Eliot, right? You can't have the Odyssey and the Iliad without Homer, or somebody named Homer, somebody called Homer. And you do need the one sort of great genius to produce this piece, but you also, in many cases, you need somebody that you trust with equal or even better literary sensibilities. In the dedication to The Wasteland, Eliot calls Pound the better craftsman, il miglior fabbro in Italian. And so, you need somebody that you trust almost more than yourself to edit and work on your creations. And that's particularly true for Pound, as we will get into as we study this poem. Pound did a lot to transform the original manuscript of The Wasteland to the point of just cutting massive bits out of it, for example. And so this relationship between Pound and Eliot is, in some ways, it's kind of like the relationship between the intellectually productive friendships between men that we talked about when we talked about the Symposium, this idea that Plato had of spiritual pregnancy, or of becoming so close with a friend that you are able to produce together these tremendous testaments to your intellectual relationship. I think in some ways, The Wasteland is an example of that exact kind of relationship. So Eliot goes to Paris, he gives the manuscript of The Wasteland to Ezra Pound, and Pound edits it. And then it is published twice. It's published in Britain and in the US. In Britain, it's published in the Criterion. In the US, it's published in the Dial. And it does make kind of a splash. The reactions to it are mixed, but it is not one of these things that takes forever to kind of gain its reputation. It pretty quickly became something that people recognized as a hallmark of the modernist movement, which was a self-conscious, people knew, they called themselves modernized or modernists. People knew at this point in time that there was a movement in literature going on called modernism, and we are going to get to that. But before we do, I want to just briefly talk for a second about why all of this stuff about Eliot's life matters at all. I mean, I sort of hinted at this a moment ago when I was saying, well, he was a sickly kid, but how much can that really explain all of what he wrote? A lot of people like to read poetry, especially a poem like this, which, as we will get into, is highly elusive, full of allusions, full of these kind of little coded references to other stuff. A lot of people want to take a poem like that and find sort of hidden references to the poet's biography. It's like a James Taylor song. Like if you love James Taylor, you know that he writes these kind of beautiful but sort of inscrutable lyrics. And a lot of people want to be like, oh, this is because he was, dating this woman at this time. I think you can get kind of silly with that when it comes to poetry. I mean, not everything is about yourself. Not everything that a poet writes is about himself. And if you try just to kind of unpack the whole thing to get references to Eliot's life, then of course you're going to miss the major point. But the other funny thing about this is that Eliot himself was actually kind of self-deprecating about the poem in exactly this way. He said, look, everybody wants to draw these enormous kind of cultural meanings, these big statements about the West out of my poetry. But he said, it is just a piece of rhythmical grumbling. The Wasteland is just a kind of reflection on the way that I was feeling at a certain time. Now, so you have to kind of balance these two things. You have to balance the fact that the poem obviously is about more than just Eliot's life, and the fact that Eliot himself said it does come out of a very particular moment in my life, this moment of sickness, of retiring from the world, of not being in a very happy marriage, right? Eliot himself says, that's part of what's in here. Part of what's in here is my experience of the world at this time. How do we square these two things? How do we draw, bigger meaning out of this poem than just this is what Eliot's life was, without disregarding the fact that a lot of Eliot's life is in the poem? Well, here's another thing that Eliot said, which I think kind of gets it right. He said, the great poet, in writing himself, writes his time. So this seems right to me. We talked a lot in our C.S. Lewis episode, and in general, we talk a lot on this podcast about the reality of the inner life, right? The facts of your experience that you can't get across just by telling somebody this is what happened to me on this day. You have to convey something more about the joy that you feel or the despair that you feel. So the inner life of the poet is tremendously important. And the way that Eliot was experiencing his particular life at this time, his dissatisfaction with his marriage, his dissatisfaction with, his health and his difficulties with his health, all of that stuff, that sense of unease and angst is all in here. But what makes a work of literature or any work of art truly great is that it takes that personal experience of the world and it captures something about the way that, everybody is kind of feeling at that moment, or the mood that's in the air in a particular important place and time. And I think the mood that Eliot captured in this kind of weirdly providential, darkly providential moment of suffering, the mood that Eliot captured was this mood of disaffection and disillusionment between the wars, this sense that everything was just, not even that everything was falling chaotically apart, but more that everything was drab, that was dry and dusty and sad and kind of gray. And we're going to get into sort of how that, feels in this poem. I've said already that it is a modernist poem. And Ezra Pound, said of Eliot, he said he has actually trained himself and modernized himself on his own. And what he meant by that was that there were all of these kind of fashionable schools of poetry at the time, people meeting in salons to sort of talk about what poetry should be. And Pound thought that Eliot had kind of grasped this spirit of modernism without kind of fashionable induction into that world. And so we have to think a little bit about kind of what that means, what it means to write a modernist poem. I mean, in some ways, this poem, The Wasteland, is the quintessential modernist poem. The quintessential modernist novel, which we will also talk about, is James Joyce's Ulysses, probably. We'll get there in a future episode. But in lyric poetry, when you think about modernist lyric poetry, typically what you're talking about the breakdown of traditional form. So, for example, by contrast, when we talked about the Iliad, we mentioned that there is a set rhythm to each line called dactylic hexameter. And in a lot of traditional English poetry, this is also true. I mean, it's true in a slightly different way, but iambic pentameter, for example, in Shakespeare, right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. These kind of set numbers of syllables and sets pattern of stress in the line. There are certain rhythms that emerge importantly from the Wasteland, but they don't proceed according to this kind of rigid rule. And that's one of the hallmarks of modernist poetry. And then another important hallmark is that it's full of all these like really complicated and difficult references to other stuff. And that is this sense that, there's this huge accumulation of old poetry behind us. And it's all the great traditions of the West that we've been celebrating on this podcast. This idea in modernism is that all of those great traditions have become old and stale, and they're just kind of piled up behind you, and you're selecting all of these references to kind of just throw together to try desperately and create something new, to try and create new meaning. And in The Wasteland, that is a big part of what Eliot does. And it's one of the reasons why the poem can be really difficult to read for people initially. And one reason why it's good, I think, to have, perhaps a guide through it before you jump in, right? Is this idea that you're collecting all of these old references, which means that there's a ton of old references that you have to kind of get in order to understand the poem. This is not a poem that you can read without notes. Eliot wrote his own notes that go with the poem, but I think you need much more than just those notes. There's a wonderful edition which I am using on this podcast, which is the Norton Critical Edition. You can see me, if you can see me, I'm holding it up. But one of the great things about this edition is, there's the poem itself is quite short, and it's this tiny part of the book is the poem itself. And then there's this whole section called Context, which is just a vast selection of little excerpts so that you can go and read the stuff that Eliot is referring to. Now, there's a problem with this, which is, if you want to just sit down and read a lyric poem, you don't necessarily also want to go and conduct an entire study on the whole of Western literature, right? I obviously think that you should read a lot of Western literature and that Western literature is great, but, it kind of feels when you first open this poem as if you have to have read literally everything to understand it. So how do we kind of get our foot in the door with this poem? Well, I think my recommendation, if you're going to go away and read this poem, my recommendation is first just read it and don't read any notes. Don't worry about all of this kind of, hyper literary illusion, and just enjoy the rhythms and the sounds of it. Because Eliot himself, as we will discuss further later on, Eliot himself was tremendously passionate about the music of poetry. People often, of course, make comparisons between music and poetry, but Eliot was a great lover of opera, and he talked a lot about how important rhythm was to him. Remember when we talked about Homer, right? That Homer was music. And Eliot thought of his poetry as verbal music. And as I read it aloud, hopefully you will hear a lot of the kind of compelling rhythms that make it so hypnotic, even though a lot of the time you have no idea what he's talking about. So first just read the thing. And then when you read the thing, and if you fall in love with it, which I hope you will, because it is a great work, then that kind of inspires you to take individual lines that you find interesting and go and chase them up and look up sort of like, why is he saying this? And this is, in many ways, it's kind of its own little education in Western literature. It's an eclectic education because you just get the stuff that Eliot is selecting for the poem. But it's not a bad way, actually, to kind of find your way through. If you're not familiar with a ton of the Western literary tradition, it's not a bad way to sort of find your way through. There's a great quote that I love here. Another book that's really good if you want to help yourself to get into the Wasteland is this little tiny critical guide, the Connell Guide by Seamus Perry, which again I'm holding up if you can see me. And it contains one of my favorite things. It contains this section of reactions to the poem, people who have reacted to Eliot's Wasteland. And this is my favorite one. This is Ralph Ellison, another great writer whom we'll talk about. He's sort of known as one of America's great Black writers, and he talks about the relationship between the Wasteland and jazz, because of course jazz was another thing that was tremendously popular during this time. And here's what Ralph Ellison says about the Wasteland. He says, "The Wasteland seized my mind. I was intrigued by its power to move me, while eluding my understanding. Somehow, Its rhythms were often closer to those of jazz than those of the Negro poets. And even though I could not understand them, its range of illusion was as mixed and as varied as that of Louis Armstrong. Yet, there were its discontinuities, its changes of pace, and its hidden system of organization, which escaped me. There was nothing to do but look up the references in the footnotes to the poem, and thus began my conscious education in literature. So that's one of the literary greats, Ralph Ellison, talking about exactly this phenomenon, that you start out, you kind of love the way a poem sounds. There's no shame in loving the way a poem sounds and not understanding it, if that lets you kind of get slowly into looking up how to understand it. So I am, in this podcast, going to read a fair amount of this poem, and I am going to explain some of the references. But I think the first thing to kind of get into this poem is to know that it is music, and you can just appreciate it as music, even though, you know, it kind of it's intimidating for a lot of people because it's so full of these kind of erudite literary allusions. One more thing about the allusions, and then we will get into the poem itself. Why are they there, right? Why? It's not just so that he can sound smart, or you can sound smart because you can guess or know what the allusions are. That's not the point of all this. I said already, right, that one of the hallmarks of modernism is this sense that all of the great traditions which stand behind you, even if they were great, even if they were transcendent and tremendously powerful, are kind of dead, that something has happened, in this case, the Great War, that has caused people to lose their faith, both in God and in the tradition. And again, there's no just getting away from this. There's no saying, oh, that's dumb or wrong or stupid. It was a way that a lot of smart people felt. And even though, of course, I think that the truest thing to then do and the smartest thing to then do is to realize that there is still meaning and there is still joy. You can't get there by just sort of pretending like the despair doesn't exist. So this sense that, all the old traditions are falling apart or have fallen apart, and all you can do is kind of, Eliot describes it as shoring up fragments against your ruin, just kind of pick up these little pieces of old literature and put them together. And he mixes high literature with just little, bar songs and kind of slang and all this stuff. Later on in four quartets, he would write this great line, which we'll talk about four quartets later. Garlic and sapphires in the mud clot the bedded axle tree. This idea that you're digging your hands through mud, and some of it's garlic, some of it's this kind of earthy stuff, and some of it's sapphire. So this sense of kind of digging back through this broken and dying history in order to get at something new and something true. And that's why, even though the allusions are hard and they can be kind of annoying at first, they actually have tremendous weight and importance and value. So here's what I'm going to do in these 2 episodes about the Wasteland as we move through the poem. There are 5 sections to the poem and an epigraph, and I'm going to take each of those and just focus on one allusion that I think is particularly good. So I'll read a passage and then I'll just explain sort of one thing and show how it works, show how the kind of literary allusions and the stuff that he's dredging up from the past contributes to the meaning of the poem and to the sense that, everything is sort of falling apart. So we're going to start actually with the epigraph, and this is becoming kind of a theme for us on Young Heretics. We spent a lot of time when I talked about C.S. Lewis, we spent a lot of time on his epigraph to the abolition of man. And I think people don't spend enough time kind of decoding epigraphs. You kind of read the quote at the beginning of a poem or of a speech, and you think, yeah, okay, whatever, get me to the meat of the thing. And then you forget sometimes that it was even there. But if you go back and you pay close attention, it'll tell you something. It's like an inscription over a doorway as you're entering a great cathedral, right? It tells you something about the kind of space you're about to enter into. So in this case, Eliot begins The Wasteland with a quote from the Satyricon, which is not a work that a lot of people read these days. We will probably get to it. It's by a guy named Gaius Petronius. And it's this big, messy Latin work. It's written in Latin, although it has quotes in other languages in it. And it's basically this was a kind of literature that existed a lot in the ancient world. It's like the conceit is that it's this sort of learned dinner party. The characters in it are these dinner guests who all gather around. They're all very smart and kind of erudite. And they just make all of these allusions and tell all of these stories, these little, gems that they've found from, another dinner party or from their own experience, their own travels, kind of bring together. And that's just a way of gathering into one book this sort of anthology of interesting tidbits and literary curiosities. And so in some ways, this is what Eliot is doing too, right? He's gathering all of these different allusions. But in another way, it's it's hearkening back to a time when that project was more hopeful and more meaningful, because in the ancient world you have this sense that people were living in a coherent culture. They still had belief in themselves and in each other and in their culture. And so it's hearkening back to this time when you had a kind of erudite literary circle of friends that you could get together with over drinks and dinner and tell all of these sort of sophisticated stories. So there's other books like this, other works like this from the ancient world. There's the De Sophists by Athenaeus, and a number of other things. In many ways, it kind of harks even further back to the Symposium. When we talked about the Symposium, right, that's a work that brings a bunch of sort of smart guys together as characters into one room, and they all, in this case, make a speech about love, but they all sort of contribute this kind of little gemstone that they have brought from their cultural travels. So that's the Satyricon, and that's what Eliot selects from to begin the Wasteland. And like I say, in some ways, this is a model for what Eliot is doing, but in other ways, it's kind of, we wish that we lived in the time when, in the classical period, when these allusions and these dinner parties had more meaning and hope, but now we just kind of gather these old dead fragments in some ways. And the way that we can tell that there's going to be despair is because of the fragment of the Satyricon that Eliot selects. It's a fragment in Latin and Greek, and I'm going to read the Latin and Greek because it seems like people are enjoying hearing these ancient languages on these shows, and then I will translate. He says, Nam Sibyllam quidem cumis ego ipse oculis meis vidi in ampulla pendere, et cum illi pueri dicerent Sibylla titheles respondebat illa apothanein thelo. And so they tell the story in Latin, and then the Sibyl, the Cumaean Sibyl, responds in Greek. I once saw with my own eyes the Cumaean Sibyl hanging in a jar, and when the boys asked her, Sibyl, what do you want? She answered, I want to die. Now, what on earth does this mean? What is this selection? Well, the Cumaean Sibyl was a prophetess, and that's what a Sibyl is in the ancient world, is a prophetess. And the most famous story about her was that the god Apollo wanted to take her virginity, and so he offered her anything that she wanted in exchange for her virginity. And what she said, she took a handful of sand, the Cumaean Sibyl, and said, I want to live for as many years as there are grains in this handful of sand. So she wanted fabulously long life. Now, Apollo granted this to her, but she forgot to ask for youth. And so she lived for, innumerable years, and then just kept getting older and older. And the reason that she's in a jar in this little story is because her body shrivels up, and eventually it's only her voice left. But at this point, she's in a jar, and the boys that come to talk to her say, what do you want? And she says, I want to die. I just want to die. I wished for long life, but it was a curse rather than a blessing. So of course, there's tremendous significance in this for Eliot personally, but also for the West more generally, in the way that he's kind of looking out on England and on London and on Europe in between the wars, and just saying, we've survived longer than we should have. This is this kind of unnatural, sickly endurance that we have going on here, because everything has lost its meaning, and we're just, we wish we could die. We're like the Cumaean Sibyl, we wish we could die. So that's the incredibly cheery opener to the Wasteland, but I think it's also incredibly evocative. It's extremely beautiful and sad, this story. It's an incredibly powerful. I mean, one of the great things about this poem is it's just full of these heart-wrenching images for the state of the West, and it manages to get at that state in a way that makes you feel it, right? Which is, of course, one of the major points of poetry, is to communicate to you not just what's going on, but what it's like to be alive during a certain period of time. And that's why I began with this Eliot quote. As Eliot communicates his own experience of despair and desolation to us, he also communicates this sort of grand cultural sense of decay and of just being too old for your own good, basically. This is one of the things, this epigraph is one of the things that Pound made Eliot change. And so Eliot had picked originally kind of a climactic section from this novel, Heart of Darkness. And we won't get into sort of the plot of Heart of Darkness, but this is basically the narrator is observing the death of another character, and he says, "Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was not more than a breath. The horror, the horror." So you can see that that's a similar vibe, right? This image, at some image, at some vision, this sense of kind of grasping for images as you're passing out of the world. But I think this was, people debate whether or not Pound was right to make Eliot change this. But I do think that the one he picked in the end is better, this sort of Cumaean Sibyl wishing to die in a jar. I told you this was going to be the most depressing episode of Young Heretics, and I think I am delivering on that. But again, we are moving in a direction, right? We're charting how Eliot's conversion happened and how it played out in his literary life. And in order to get to that, in order to get to the truth of a conversion for somebody as honest and sophisticated and perceptive as Eliot was, in order to get to his conversion, we have to go with him through his despair, because it's also our despair. It's also the modernist condition to kind of look at the world and feel as if everything is falling apart. And you can't just kind of shrug that off and be like, but yay, everything's fine. You know, this is what we're doing here in this series of episodes in Young Heretics, is we're taking this journey with Eliot through despair and into hope. So we are going to get to hope. But first, we will embark upon the first part of this poem. Okay, so we jump into part one of this poem. Like I said, there are 5 parts, and part 1 is called The Burial of the Dead. Before I get into The Burial of the Dead, again, most depressing episode ever. Before I get into that, let me just say thank you so much for listening and watching, for being a part of this show. I am so grateful to all of you who are following along with this podcast. If you have not already, I urge you to subscribe. It will help you to get new episodes. And if you're really feeling generous, you could leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, which really, really helps the show out. Thank you so much to those of you who have already done so. If you haven't yet, please do give us a 5-star review, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. Okay. Thanks for being with us. Let's jump into part 1 of The Wasteland, The Burial of the Dead. I'm going to start by noting once again that Ezra Pound transformed this poem. It is in many ways a product of intellectual collaboration between T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, because the first line of The Wasteland is one of the most famous first lines in all of literature, right? April is the cruelest month. You probably have heard it. Now, there was a lot more to this poem before that first line, when Eliot gave the poem, the first draft of the poem, to Pound. And Pound basically just cut it all out. He's like, cut it all out, start here. Start with April is the cruelest month, which of course was a genius move, because this is a phenomenal opening. But it's not the opening that Eliot initially planned. So what's the point of it? Why do we begin here with this notion of April kind of being particularly cruel? Well, it's because in winter, right, you can just forget. Winter is death. Winter is when you kind of go to sleep under the snow and you pretend the world outside doesn't exist. But April is the cruelest month, says Eliot, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. We wish in the West, we wish, as Eliot's speaker does, that we could die. But April kind of revives us and brings us up to new hope, only to remind us of the agony of our suffering. So that's sort of where we begin. That's the place where we begin in this poem. As I say, I'm going to focus in each section on just one little chunk and on the importance of a particular allusion within the poem. So the first thing that I want to get to is the music element, right? Because I mentioned already that Eliot loved opera, he loved music, and he cared very much about the relationship between music and poetry. He thought that music should be like poetry and that poetry should be like music. And he talks a lot about the rhythms of the poem, the kind of, the way that it should hypnotize you and draw you in. And he has a quote about this, actually, that I will read before I get into the kind of musical references here. He says, "The feeling for syllable and rhythm penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling, invigorating every word, sinking to the most primitive and forgotten, returning to the origin and bringing something back, seeking the beginning and the end." So that's in itself a rather poetic series of statements about sort of how the music of a poem is supposed to work. So as I mentioned, Eliot was a fan of the opera, and in particular of German opera. He personally knew Stravinsky, the famous composer, but his real obsession in this poem is with Wagner, about whom we will certainly talk later on in this podcast. Wagner lives in the 1800s, a German composer, famously, unfortunately, associated with Nazism, so likely to be canceled fairly soon. But his work, complicatedly enough, his work is great, tremendously great. And he was a huge influence on Eliot. There's lots here from Wagner's Ring Cycle, which is in many ways his masterwork. But what I'm focusing on here in this first section is this reference actually to Tristan and Isolde, which is a different Wagnerian opera. And people don't talk as much about the Wagnerian references in this poem because they're so busy digging out the literary references to other poems and things like that. But there is a ton of Wagner in here. And in fact, there is a quote in German from Tristan and Isolde. This is a good example of, the part of the poem that, even if you're kind of attracted to it, it's like, geez, you've got untranslated German in your English poem. People a lot of times these days sort of think this is impossible to understand. But so let us, therefore, unpack it a little bit. Tristan and Isolde, the opera from which this allusion comes, is the story of lost love, right? It tells the story of a knight, Tristan, who is commissioned to transport this princess Isolde so that she can be married to a king, Mark. But of course, as he's transporting her on their boat, they drink a magic love potion and fall tremendously, passionately, desperately in love. And they attempt to consummate this love, but King Mark finds out and basically attacks and fatally wounds Tristan. And so Act 3 is Tristan dying of his wound, desperately hoping that Isolde will come back to see him basically before he dies. And he sort of looks out across the sea. He's looking out across the sea to try and find out if she's coming. She does eventually come. She arrives, but he's already dead. And she has this kind of vision, this transcendent vision of him and of being reunited with him in the afterlife. So that's Tristan and Isolde, high poetry of lost love, but also of sort of transcendent love, conquering death, and all of this sort of great romantic stuff. Here is the section of the Wasteland, part 1 of the Wasteland, in which that comes up. This is for those of you following along at home. I'm starting here at line 30, which is still in English, one of the most famous lines of the poem. "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," says Eliot. And then he switches to this German quotation, "Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu, mein irisch Kind, wo weilest du?" And then back into English. This is Eliot, no longer the quote, right? "You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence." And then back into German, "Öd und leer das Meer." Forgive my German pronunciation, but what the heck is going on here? We have this sort of this enigmatic English passage framed by 2 German quotations from this opera, Tristan and Isolde. And the 2 quotations, the first one is translated, "Fresh blows the wind to the homeland, my Irish child, where do you wait?" That's the first quotation, which is from the very beginning of Tristan and Isolde. And then from the 3rd act, the last quotation, "Öd und leer das Meer," is "desolate and empty is the sea." So what Eliot is doing here masterfully is he's sandwiching his English language observation of the present with these two brackets from Tristan and Isolde. The first part is the hopeful part, where they're traveling across the sea together and about to fall desperately, passionately in love. And the second part is the part of deepest desolation, where they're looking across this empty sea, trying to see if they will ever be reunited. And we do not get, importantly, right? And this is how these illusions work: is you grasp what he's taking and notice what he's leaving out. You don't get the moment of transcendence when they kind of are reunited in the afterlife. You just get all of the hope of new love, and then all of the despair of having lost your love and being wounded and waiting for her to return, but you will never see her again. So that is kind of, he frames it with that, by basically sucking all of the hope out of Tristan and Isolde and giving us then this strange relationship between kind of unknown people. You gave me hyacinths, right? So it seems to be a man and a woman in a relationship, and they're staring at one another, or he's staring at her in the silence, the heart of light, the silence. And there is this ambiguity of that silence, right, where you don't quite know, is there going to be anything redemptive in there? And Eliot just refuses to come right out and give it to you, right? So he'll give you Tristan and Isolde. He'll give you this aching sense of love, of needing love and being on the brink of love, but then he will not consummate it. He won't give you that love or that consolation. So this is kind of where we're at, right? And this is why, again, April is the cruelest month. This sort of sense of ginning up these romantic feelings, of generating expectations and getting your hopes up and then having them disappointed. That's why April is crueler than winter, which doesn't even give you any hope really at all, and lets you kind of live under the snow. So that's the illusion that I'm going to explain in that first section. It goes on with one of the most famous sections of really any poem, but again, of this poem, the unreal city, in which he watches people moving probably across London Bridge. In fact, around London Bridge, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought death had undone so many. This is a reference to Dante's Inferno and to watching the souls of the dead in the underworld, but now he's watching people, the spirits of the dead from the war perhaps, or maybe just the people the kind of living dead in the city, passing across the bridge, sort of watching just all these people who were dead, both inside and eventually, we know, outside, right? So there ends part one, or at least our analysis of part one. Go away and read it. The whole thing is like that, right? The whole thing is kind of this little dense maze that you read it and you enjoy the sounds, and then you kind of draw out of it this incredible richness and depth. And it does communicate to you this gray, sort of sepia-toned depiction of Europe between the wars. The point of all of this, again, right, you have to face up to that. You have to face up to the darkness and experience the darkness so that you can move forward out of it into the light. And it's amazing to me to think, as I am reading this incredibly depressing first part of The Wasteland, that Eliot did, in fact, move past it and into the light. And we will get there in this episode, toward, or at least we'll get some motion toward what will happen in the next episode when we kind of have the first inklings of hope. But for now, all we have is just this kind of emptiness of wanting hope, but being denied it in this first section. And that moves us on to section 2, to part 2, a game of chess. And this is the last part that we will discuss on this episode before we move on in the next episode to do parts 3, 4, and 5. So part 2 is called A Game of Chess, and I'm going to start by reading just the opening of it. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, where the glass held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out, another hid his eyes behind his wing, doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory and colored glass, unstoppered, lurked her strange, synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the sense in odors. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the laqueria, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam, then skipping forward just a little bit. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing, the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the air. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. So what is going on here? Well, true Young Heretics fans might recognize this first line, the chair she sat in like a burnished throne. Back in episode 3, I read a speech from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra describing Cleopatra seducing Antony by appearing on this barge, on this boat. And that begins the barge she sat on like a burnished throne. And so this is a direct reference, a kind of recreation of that speech, that description of Cleopatra, the face that launched 1,000 ships, right, which is actually Helen of Troy, but also, Cleopatra, this kind of destroyer of empires, this woman whose seductive power is so great that she can lead men to ruin and whole empires to despair. So that is kind of what's in the background here. But the description is of this kind of incredibly gaudy and sort of dead, spiritually dead setting with all of these paintings and pictures and images of stuff on the wall, these kind of stories of, one of the stories is of Tereus and Philomela, which is a story of sexual violence from the ancient world. There's all of these kind of references and pictures on the wall behind this woman who is sitting in the place of Cleopatra, but is in a kind of tawdry, modern version of what Cleopatra's glory was, right? Cleopatra's glory was real and actually kind of transcended time and space to be this incredibly powerful force in the world in Shakespeare's play and also in history, as we learned in episode 3, right? But here we've got this kind of, just replacement of that with something just cheap, and we're going to go on as we talk about the various women in these poems, to talk about the cheapness, the emptiness of their lives. And what's going on here, I think, in many ways, is that, and Eliot said at one point that something like this was true, that all of the women in this poem are kind of one woman, and they're all this archetype of the feminine that has become kind of lost and corrupt. In Cleopatra's day, there was this idea of womanhood which rose almost to godhead, that the power of a woman to persuade a man, to seduce a man, to transform an empire, to lead an empire of her own, was one of these sort of two great titanic forces in the world. Womanhood and manhood are these transcendent things. And Eliot is basically saying, that birthright is still with us, that sense of ourselves as beings meant for a great destiny, great women and great men, is still there, but all we have is this kind of tawdry modern world, this world emptied out of all of its meaning. I think there's a lot here for us to recognize of ourselves, right? This sense that even though we have this great birthright, even though we are sort of surrounded by all of these recollections of what it is to be human and what it is to be a man or what it is to be a woman, we have also kind of so lost our hope and so despaired of that we feel out of place among the symbols of our own greatness. And so that's why I think this poem is so magnificent, is it captures that sense that you kind of take all of the framework of the Great West and then you put modern people into it, and they seem kind of small and paltry and sad. Now, there is a glimmer of hope in this very thing, I believe. And I'm going to get more into this in the next episode when I talk next about the Wasteland. But here is the glimmer of hope that exists in this kind of way of depicting the modern world. If our experience is that we are not living up to our birthright, if we have this intuition that we're supposed to be Cleopatra, that women are supposed to be Cleopatra, these tremendous, dignified, glorious, beautiful beings, powerful beings, and yet we note that modern people just don't feel that way, just don't feel that transcendence. That very sense of not living up to our birthright tells us that we have a birthright. We wouldn't feel any kind of despair about this if we were just meant to be kind of depressed, sickly, modern people moving about like ghosts between the world wars, right? If that was just what humanity is, then we wouldn't have any sense of despair about it. It would just be what things are. But what is genius about Eliot is that in the background of the despair, creating the despair almost, is our intuition that human beings are meant for something much greater. And that is one of the major points, one of the reasons why he incorporates all of these allusions to ancient literature, classical literature, and even just, great English literature of the past, like Shakespeare, for example, right? The reason that he creates that backdrop is not only so that we moderns will seem small in comparison, it's so that we will have a sense that that backdrop exists, right? And we, in reading this poem, can take that out of it, right? We can see that even our despair, even the despair that you indeed may be feeling right now about the modern world, is proof that the world is meant to be great and noble. We're going to get into a lot more of that in the next episode when we finish reading this poem. But that's where we've gotten to so far, just reading sort of the first half or maybe third of the poem. Come back next week and we will finish T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and talk more about what hope there is in this landscape of despair. For now, however, let us close out this episode with the mailbag. Thank you again for sending in all of your questions. It has been so much fun to read all of them. This time around, I want to address a question that a number of people have asked me in a number of different ways. Basically, the question is, how can I convince either my kids or my friends to read great literature or to care about Western culture more generally? Which is an excellent question, right? Because as much as we are excited to be doing this podcast and as much as it's awesome that people are listening and watching, there's really a lot of just kind of spiritual emptiness out there, right? People who love and care about the traditions of the West are in the minority. In some sense, they are always in the minority, right? I mean, this is on one level, the West is for everybody, but not everybody is going to be passionate about, reading T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in detail. And that's okay. It's not like that's not a moral failing. I think that the first thing to say is, to think about what this has to offer actual human beings, right? That's why this podcast exists to begin with, is that I believe that even if you do not want to go away and learn ancient Greek, that there is stuff that I can take out of an ancient Greek poem and give to you that will enrich you. And you don't have to be like, professorial about it, right? You don't have to be a college professor who's like, well, we begin, in the 3rd century BC. You don't have to kind of go back to the very beginning and just persuade people that they need to read everything, You can just find the thing that you think somebody's really going to get into. And I talked about this a little bit on this episode with Eliot, that, if your route into the poem is the rhythm of it and the music of it, that's great. That's awesome. And then, from there, you kind of develop a certain interest in understanding the references to the poem and all of that stuff. Find something, if you're trying to get your friend or your kid into it, find something that, you think that they particularly will like. It's a lot about relationship as well. The other thing is that for kids, I'm not a parent, so I don't want to tell you how to parent your children. But it does seem to me that kids, it's a little bit different because, you do actually need somebody to just make you study stuff as a kid. And this is something that we feel kind of uncomfortable about in the modern world, that kids, need to be free to express themselves and to learn, whatever. No, that is ridiculous. Like, the whole point of being a child is that you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know how great your inheritance is as a human being. So training a kid, educating a kid, don't be afraid to give them something that they might kind of be like, I don't really like this, and be like, whatever, just sit with it for a month, right? Let's sit with this poem or something that you're going to love eventually for a month. C.S. Lewis talks about this in The Weight of Glory, which I mentioned on an earlier episode, that you actually have to be schooled in loving and enjoying great literature. And if you are raising a kid and you want them to love and enjoy great literature, you can do that with them. I mean, you have to kind of yourself cultivate that love first, but shaping the soul away from kind of cheap crap and toward stuff that will enrich you and stay with you for your whole life and fortify you spiritually. That is an actual project. It's what used to be called the project of education. And so I think if you're trying to get your kids into great literature, into Western literature, the first thing is just, tell them they're going to do it. And you don't have to be mean about it, but you just say, this is, look, this is going to be part of our lives now. We're going to read together for half an hour before bed every day. Again, not a parent, not a parenting expert. Don't want to tell you how to parent your kid, but it seems to me that when people are asking, how do I convince my children to get into great literature? Just tell them you're going to read 30 minutes of pick a great book and read 30 minutes of it. Read C.S. Lewis every day. Read Tolkien, read Homer, really anybody. I mean, they don't have to understand everything. That's the other thing, right? And we got into this with Eliot today. You do not, in order to embark upon a literary journey, need to feel as if you perfectly understand every line. Enjoying something, just tasting something, getting into the feel of it will be your motivation to understand it, not the other way around. That is my advice for getting people, children especially, into great literature. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you enjoy this show and this podcast, I think you will probably also really love the stuff that my employers at the Claremont Institute do. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. Go there. There is a ton of great writing, especially right now in this moment, that is very valuable about the American tradition and the American founding. It has been such a blast to be with you once again. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.